So I know a lot of people may disagree with my opinion on Thor Love and Thunder, and that's totally fine, but please give me a chance to explain why I choose to defend it. When I first saw Thor Love and Thunder, I really enjoyed it and thought it was well made for what it was. I had my gripes with it, but still mostly liked it. I have since seen it a second time after hearing some differing opinions, and after doing so, I came to understand why some didn't care for it. For me personally, I liked how Thor Love and Thunder was a movie that didn't take itself all too seriously, but still had some serious moments. I felt like Taika Waititi did a good job of knowing when to go comedic and when to go dark. However, I know that the humor in the movie was a bit much for some people, which is a criticism that I can understand. I enjoyed most of the humor, but there are some jokes and gags that don't fully stick the landing for me, and I think I arrived at the conclusion that Thor Love and Thunder is just an acquired taste, and I think was accidentally made for a more niche audience that I just so happened to be a part of. I also agree with the criticism that some of the characters were underutilized. I wanted to see Thor and the Guardians of the Galaxy do more together. I also felt that Valkyrie and Sif weren't utilized, and so was Christian Bale as Gore the God Butcher. And there are some moments where I felt Thor did act out of character a little bit. I also didn't enjoy the movie as much as Ragnarok or the first Thor, but I still enjoyed Thor Love and Thunder for what it was, even if it wasn't quite as good as I hoped. Although I definitely enjoyed it more than Thor the Dark World. But even with its flaws, I do think there are still some things to find enjoyment in. I liked how the movie gave us more insight on Thor and Jane's relationship that was left unknown in the previous movies. The movie was visually dazzling and had a great color scheme, as well as some good action. I liked the cancer story arc for Jane and thought Natalie Portman gave a great last performance, showing us a more vulnerable side of the character. Chris Hemsworth is just as charming as ever, even if the writing was a bit strange for the character. And even with his limited screen time, Christian Bale was still amazingly creepy as Gore the God Butcher. And as silly as the movie is, I appreciated the serious moments when they were there. It's definitely not perfect, and there are some things that I wish were done differently, but I still have fun when I watch Thor Love and Thunder, and think that it gets more hate than it actually deserves. I don't think it's a top tier MCU movie, but I don't think it's bottom either. For me, it's somewhere in the middle. If you didn't like the movie, I understand that. All I ask is that you respect my opinion, even if you disagree.
Now, although this movie does have really positive reviews, in fact, I think it's like the 85th highest rated movie on IMDb. Whenever I see it mentioned on places like Reddit, I just always see people like saying, oh, this movie's like so overrated, it's not even that good. And while I was kind of in the same boat at first where I didn't really see what all the hype was surrounding it, but over time, it just really grew on me, and now it's my favorite movie of all time. And although a lot of people criticize it for being, for just like copying like Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy, I don't really believe this to be the case. Like, you can definitely tell it was like heavily inspired by it, but it took those ideas and it created something brand new. And Joaquin Phoenix's performance in this movie was absolutely phenomenal. And like, I honestly think it was almost just as good as Heath Ledger's. Like, he really like captured that bizarre like Joker personality super well, while also making him incredibly tragic and sympathetic. And this movie just has such a powerful like message because it shows like what isolation can do to a person, and it also like makes us like reflect on our own life choices and like how we treat people. And overall, I think this is definitely one of the best films of the past decade.
I'm pretty sure most of us can agree that the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight trilogy is absolutely phenomenal. Considering the critical and commercial success of The Dark Knight, people's expectations for The Dark Knight Rises were astronomical. A lot of people expected this film to be as good, if not better than The Dark Knight, by not only sticking the landing, but also sending off the entire trilogy on a satisfying high note. There's a good portion of people who often dismiss The Dark Knight Rises as they think it's a terrible movie, it completely ruined the franchise, yada yada yada. Some people out there think that Batman v Superman is better than this movie.
Ho, brother, whoa, now. You got too much dip on your chip.
Now, look, we're free to all have opinions, but when it comes to that particular statement, it's just so appalling to me. Look, people can say what they will about The Dark Knight Rises, but the flaws in Batman v Superman are a lot more insulting to me than the flaws in The Dark Knight Rises. Now, look, I'm fully aware that The Dark Knight Rises is far from perfect. I do acknowledge the film's issues, whether it came to the Talia al Ghul plot twist, which felt very unearned. The way they killed off Bane did feel a bit disappointing and anticlimactic, and the ending does seem very dicey for some people because of the fact that Bruce Wayne is somebody who swore supposed to be an obsessive superhero till the day he dies, so yeah, it wasn't quite faithful to the Batman mythos. But with all those flaws aside, it's still a quality film because it still contains all the things we love about the first two films in the Dark Knight trilogy. For me personally, The Dark Knight Rises is such a beautiful exploration of spiritual redemption from the darkness of despair. It's an allegory of how being broken can rot the soul and the journey back to embracing of who you truly are. I find the emotional speeches to be very moving, the fight scenes are epic, and out of all the three films of the Dark Knight movies, Rises is where the stakes feel the highest. All of those aspects for me are just too good to be overshadowed. Regardless of what anybody thinks, The Dark Knight Rises to me is both epic in scale and impactful in motion, and overall I thought it did such a spectacular job of concluding one of the greatest movie trilogies of all time. It may be flawed, but it's still a damn great movie, and anybody who thinks that The Dark Knight Rises is a terrible film, then you are just fickle to me.
So Spider-Man 3 is by no means a perfect movie. However, I do think that it gets way more hate than it deserves. The things that are great about Spider-Man 3 really are great. The acting from Tobey Maguire is still great, Kirsten Dunst still does a good job and is easily the most well-rounded character in the movie. The action sequences are still pretty top-notch and even pretty intense at times. The emotional moments hit all the right beats, and I love the movie's themes about forgiveness and seeing that the evil in other people is just as much in ourselves. The movie is definitely convoluted with an overabundance of characters and story arcs, and has a lot of story problems, but the emotional weight of the movie is why Spider-Man 3 is better than it gets credit for, in my personal opinion. It's definitely the weakest in the trilogy, and I could nitpick the movie to death, but I still think it's redeemed by its emotional weight and great character moments.
Although this movie definitely isn't as good as the first one, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, I still do think it's an incredible sequel. While, sure, it might not be as scary as the first one, which was kind of one of my complaints with it, I still do think it's a really good movie, mainly because of, like, the casting here. Like, each cast member was just, like, the perfect role for their character. And the chemistry between, like, the Losers Club here was absolutely incredible. And Bill Hader as Richie was definitely the best part about this movie. Like, he was just, like, so fucking hilarious and just, like, absolutely stole every scene he was in. And while I also see that some people have issue with, like, the flashback scenes, as they say, like, it doesn't really add much to the plot. But honestly, like, I still found them to be, like, pretty entertaining. Another thing I love about this movie is how it really, like, captured the spirit of the book. And, like, the ending was just phenomenal in my opinion. And it never fails to get me emotional. And overall, this is just, like, a movie I always love revisiting. And while it's definitely not as good as the first, it still, like, very overhated and deserves a lot more love.
I remember how incredibly stoked I was to see It Chapter 2, considering how phenomenal the first It movie turned out to be. I saw the premiere of It Chapter 2 on opening night, and I remember walking out of the theaters and saying to myself, I thought it was solid, but not quite as remarkable as the first. It's a lot more flawed compared to the first one because, yeah, the runtime did feel a bit too long. They went way too overboard with the CGI effects. Some of the aspects of the film did feel a bit sloppy, and the final battle between Pennywise and the Losers Club was pretty underwhelming. But other than that, everything else of It Chapter 2 really worked for me. First and foremost, the casting was just absolutely top-notch. Like, whoever was responsible for the casting of the adult versions of the Losers Club really deserves a raise because each and every single one of them completely nailed the younger counterparts, especially Bill Hader, who absolutely steals the show. Every scene with him was just an absolute home run because he was just like the perfect actor to play the older version of Richie. I absolutely adored the way how It Chapter 2 was tackling trauma, as I thought it was like kind of sending a message that you shouldn't let the scars of your past define you for who you are. Battle scars can hurt and haunt us, but at the same time, it can also make you stronger, make you better, more empathetic, and more resilient. And the ending of the film really satisfied me for the most part. The final battle against Pennywise was a bewildering mess. It Chapter 2 really did a good job of giving the characters that we loved from the first movie good closure. It Chapter 2 may not be as great as the original, and sure, it could have been better, but it's a movie that I always have a blast rewatching, even with its shortcomings.
This is the movie on my list that in my opinion deserves more respect than it gets. Now I know most people liked El Camino and were satisfied with it, but there's some people out there who just really didn't like El Camino, and I honestly don't understand why. I know that there were people who wanted El Camino to be longer and possibly turn into a miniseries, but if you ask me, I think Vince Gilligan made the right call by just doing a 2-hour movie. If the story was a miniseries, I think it would have been too much for what's supposed to be an epilogue to Breaking Bad. El Camino to me was a nice little closing for what was already a virtually perfect TV series. Breaking Bad was a perfect ending for Walter White, and as incredible as Breaking Bad's ending was, the fact that they left Jesse's ending ambiguous can be a mixed bag for me. I personally love the sense of closure we got from El Camino. The way I see it, Breaking Bad was a perfect cake and El Camino was the cherry on top for closing out Jesse Pinkman's arc. Now, I understand people's criticisms that Aaron Paul doesn't look as youthful as he used to and that Jesse Plemons looks very different, and I can understand why some feel that it's a tacked-on movie, but I thought the sense of closure was a nice addition that felt right for Jesse's character. The film is well shot, the story, while small scale, was actually really gripping and intense. Aaron Paul gives a phenomenal performance, and as a Jesse Pinkman fan, this to me was the perfect ending for his character. People who aren't Jesse Pinkman fans will never understand what El Camino meant to Jesse Pinkman fans. Just saying.
Now, I absolutely love both Ted movies. Both of them are just so funny to me. But a lot of the people I've seen, don't really like the second one, and I've never really understood why. I mean, sure, the plot might not be as tight as it is in the first one, but I still do find it to be a really enjoyable movie. Like, the chemistry between Mark Wahlberg and Seth MacFarlane was absolutely incredible here, just like it was in the first one. And that alone just makes the movie, really entertaining to watch, because they're just, always great to watch together. And while some people might have, issue with, the repetitive, dick and sex jokes, honestly, I didn't mind, and I always find them to be, pretty funny. This movie has a lot of what made the first movie work so well. It had the humor, the heart, and I think Amanda Seyfried, or however you pronounce her name, I think she was an excellent addition to the movie. And honestly, I liked her character a bit more than I did Lori. So overall, while this movie might not be quite as good as the first one, I still do think it's a really good sequel, and it's always something I enjoy revisiting.
Now, I know it's never easy having a discussion about the Star Wars sequel trilogy, considering how badly the movies turn out to be, especially with Disney making it clear that they did not have a plan from the jump, which still to this day boggles my mind. And I do believe that most of the criticism towards the movies are justified. However, when it comes to The Force Awakens, it's always been one of my favorite entries in the Star Wars franchise. I can understand why most people criticize The Force Awakens for being a rehash of A New Hope, but for what it is entirely, I thought The Force Awakens delivered for the most part. The movie was such a perfect combination of old and new, as it presented a whole new set of characters, including Rey, played by Daisy Ridley, and Adam Driver's Kylo Ren, while also reintroducing old characters that we loved from the original trilogy, such as Han Solo, Chewbacca, and Princess Leia. Even with the predictable story, and it is very unfortunate the way how the entire trilogy panned out, The Force Awakens to me is such a fun movie that captures the spirit of the franchise's message and characters beautifully. I feel like it has aged very well, and honestly, I feel like it deserves a major reappraisal.
Okay. This is probably going to be the most divisive pick on my list. Please be gentle. When the Star Wars sequels came out, I really loved all three of them and thought they were fantastic. Now with rewatches, I have come to realize that there are story problems and some inconsistencies. I'm fully aware of the fact that Disney didn't have a foolproof plan and that the films failed at telling a cohesive story for a handful of arcs. However, I don't think the Star Wars sequels are the worst movies ever made like other people do. I think the story on paper is actually not bad, it's just the lack of cohesive storytelling and the inconsistencies that made it a mixed bag of a trilogy. I still stand by my initial opinion that The Force Awakens is a phenomenal Star Wars movie and is easily one of the best, minus a few nitpicks. The Last Jedi isn't as good as I remember, but I still think it's a lot better than people give it credit for and is way too overhated. And The Rise of Skywalker, as messy as the story is actually a pretty entertaining movie that has some genuinely incredible moments. I am an original trilogy guy, which means I'm also not crazy about the prequels, but I still find enjoyment in those movies as a Star Wars fan, minus its flaws. And if I can find enjoyment in the flawed prequel movies, then I can also find enjoyment in the flawed sequel movies. If you didn't like the sequels, that's totally fine. All I ask is that we keep the toxicity out of our differing opinions. The sequels should still get credit for its great acting, its jaw-dropping world building, its marvelous visuals and effects, the gorgeous cinematography, and its great dialogue that surpassed that of the prequels. Please don't kill me, Star Wars fans.
I'm too weak. Oh, don't kill me, please. Don't kill me. Please.
Although this is like often regarded to be like one of the most like iconic horror films of all time, whenever I see like a ranking of like all the movies, I always see this one ranked towards like the middle or like the very bottom. And I just see like a lot of people who say this movie is just like super boring, but I honestly think this movie is like really solid. And like sure, while the acting might not be like top notch, I don't really think it like detracts from the movie all that much, since it's mostly like focused on like the atmosphere and building up tension. And like the cinematography, the musical score, like was absolutely phenomenal in this film. And I even think like not showing the killer was actually like a really unique idea and something that had like never been done before in a horror film, which makes it like super iconic and original. I definitely think this movie deserves to be recognized as a classic within the horror genre, and it's something that like anyone who's a fan of the genre should at least check out once.
When Pixar made the announcement of Toy Story 4, I would not be surprised if people had either rolled their eyes or groaned at the idea of having a fourth installment in the Toy Story franchise, considering the fact that most people believe that Toy Story 3 was the perfect ending to the entire series. Now, in all honesty, did Toy Story 4 need to happen? Honestly, no. But for me personally, I feel like it does more than enough to justify its existence and captures the heart and soul of the first three movies. In hindsight, I feel like Toy Story 3 was the ending to Andy's story, not Woody's story. But that's just the way how I see it. After all, the film has Bo Peep making her triumphant return in such grand fashion, an abundance of fantastic new characters like Forky, Gabby, Keegan-Michael Key and Jordan Peele as Ducky and Bunny, and the best of all, the amazing Keanu Reeves as Duke Kaboom. Even with Toy Story 4 being the weakest of the Toy Story series, it has such a beautiful story, stunning visual effects, and overall is a movie that I'm personally glad that Pixar went ahead and made.
Now, as someone who grew up with Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, the Hobbit trilogy definitely pales in comparison, and as someone who's read the book, the movies definitely didn't capture what the book had to offer. The fact that they took a short book and turned it into a trilogy is still baffling to me, but even with the unnecessary changes, I still commend the Hobbit trilogy for allowing us to experience the world of Middle-earth in movie form again. I think that the movies are still a lot of fun to watch, even if it differs greatly from the book and isn't as masterfully crafted as the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The CGI for the enemies was a downgrade from the makeup and the practical effects of the first trilogy. The story and character writing isn't as airtight as it could be, but the world of the first trilogy is still just as entertaining in The Hobbit. The acting is still excellent, the CGI for Gollum and Smaug is impeccable, the music from Howard Shore is incredible, the practical effects when present are fantastic. The Hobbit trilogy had a lot of unnecessary stuff, but I will still defend it for allowing us to live in this world again, and for allowing us to still have fun in Middle-earth. Underrated trilogy.
This is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. But when you look at the reviews for this movie, it's not very good. And while I see a lot of people have issue with like the guy who played the main character, like I honestly don't think his performance was too bad. Like I definitely think his line delivery could have been better in certain spots, but I still think he did a great job like portraying like the dread like his character felt, and like just like the facial expressions. And the guy who played Judd though was really like amazing, and he definitely like made up for some of the more like lackluster performances here. And I just really love like the atmosphere of this movie. Like just the cinematography like really just like creates this feeling of like dread the entire time. And, like, especially the musical score is just, like, super creepy and, like, really, like, adds to the haunting vibe that this movie portrays. And this is just a movie that, like, watching it just, like, really, like, shocks you with, like, how brutal it is in regards to, like, its emotional content. And, like, especially, like, if you, like, have actually, like, lost someone, this movie just, like, hits super hard. And this is just, like, a movie that I definitely think needs to be appreciated more, and I think it was an excellent adaptation of Stephen King's novel.
Yeah, I don't think Spider-Man 3 topping my list was going to be a surprise for most of y'all watching this, considering how much I adore the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. While Spider-Man 1 and Spider-Man 2 are well beloved and universally acclaimed, Spider-Man 3 is often considered to be the black sheep of the three movies. I think everybody's fully aware that Spider-Man 3 went through lots of problems during production, considering the fact that Sam Raimi was butting heads with the Sony producers, most specifically Avi Arad, as it's the main reason why the movie didn't turn out as well as the first two did. And while there's no denying that Spider-Man 3 is flawed because it contains a lot of things that are a bit frustrating, whether if it came to Flip Marko being revealed as Uncle Ben's actual killer, or cramming in way too many villains, whether if it's Harry Osborn's emo goblin, and even Topher Grace, who was horribly miscasted as Venom. For me, Spider-Man 3 significantly has a lot more good things crammed in it than it has bad stuff crammed in it, because I feel like if you dig a little deeper, you'll find a big heart beating beneath its cheesy surface that brilliantly addresses Peter Parker's self-doubt, arrogance, repress, and guilt to forgive by having to hit rock bottom. Even with Spider-Man 3 failing to reach the heights of its predecessors, it's a movie that has so much charm, so much heart, it's endlessly rewatchable, and I will defend it until the day I die, and there's nothing that anybody can do or say that can make me change my mind about Spider-Man 3.